Great. 6 o'clock on the dot. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our webinar, Advancing Park Equity in Los Angeles and Beyond. My name is Damon Nagami. I am a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and I'm the director of NRDC's Southern California Ecosystems Project.
And hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ramya Sivasubramanian. I'm also a senior attorney with NRDC, and I'm deputy director of our environmental justice team. Together, Damon and I head up NRDC's work to ensure access to nature.
We are thrilled that you could join us tonight. We saw that there were many participants who registered. Thank you so much for your interest in this topic. We are thrilled to host a terrific panel tonight to talk about increasing equitable access to nature for communities of color and lower income communities in Los Angeles before, during, and after COVID-19.
And before we begin, we just wanted to give a huge shout out to our legal fellow, Allison Hom, for her tireless work coordinating and organizing this webinar, and of course, for all of her work with us and our partners to advance park equity. Allison's going to share a few housekeeping items before we begin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Hom, NRDC's Access to Nature Legal Fellow. Just a note that we're recording this webinar and sharing out later. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, and we encourage everyone to submit questions in the chat below. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm really excited as well to introduce Remy Della Pezza, our moderator for today. Remy is founder and principal at Morena Strategies, and she brings over 15 years of experience as a community lawyer working on land use, affordable housing, and equitable community development. And she's also the kind of person who's so committed to this work that she's here with us today, even though she's technically out of the office this week. So thank you, Remy, and I'll turn it over to you now to kick us off and introduce our amazing panelists.
Thanks, Ramya, and thanks, Damon and Allison, and just a huge thank you to NRDC's LA office for creating this space tonight for us to have a really important discussion. I think so many of us are unpacking the impacts of COVID-19 and recent civil unrest, not just on our lives and our communities, but also on our work. And this time has really reminded us how interconnected public health and systemic racism are, but also the interconnections between how land is used, who does and does not have access to nature and parks, and who gets criminalized. Tonight's panel is going to give you a really critical perspective on all of these issues rooted in their work here in Los Angeles. And I've had the honor to work with each of these amazing panelists in my career, and I'm really excited to be with you all tonight. So let me go ahead and introduce each of our panelists briefly, and then we'll dive into conversation. So we have Sissy Trin, who's the founder and executive director of the Southeast Asian Community Alliance, also known as SICA, which organizes low-income youth in Chinatown and Lincoln Heights to fight for economically and environmentally just communities. We also have Lyric Kelker, a senior associate at Inclusive Action for the City, and she researches issues affecting underserved communities, and her advocacy efforts focus on economic justice for micro entrepreneurs, small businesses, and low-income families across LA. Liliana Griego serves as Senior Manager of Policy, Advocacy, and Engagement for Friends of the LA River, where she advocates for a restored and equitably accessible LA River for all Angelinos and wildlife to enjoy. And Steve Diaz is Deputy Director of the Los Angeles LA CAN Network. Los Angeles Community Action Network, sorry, I know them as LA CAN mostly, a community-based membership organization that was created to ensure people dealing with poverty have voice and opinion in the decisions that are directly impacting them. So thank you again, all four of you, for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. Sissy, we'll start with you. What does equitable access to nature mean for Sika and the community that you work with?
So I don't know if people have ever wandered around Chinatown and kind of taken a look at the different parks we have in our community. We're actually a fairly park-rich neighborhood, but it's important to kind of notice like the difference between how mainstream, middle-class communities use parks versus how they are used in Chinatown. I think a lot of people, when they think of parks, they think of kids' soccer games and, maybe a picnic, and that's the extent of it. When you go to Chinatown, you see that it's a lot more than that, because a lot of people utilize parks as an extension of their homes, because so many of our communities live in extremely low-income housing, extremely crowded housing. You can't invite friends over to hang out just because there's no space. And so they'll go to the park and meet up at the park. You have a lot of seniors who go and play cards, or kids who will do a pickup basketball game just because they don't have space to hang out and relax at home. And then on top of that, a lot of folks use the park as space for learning about neighborhood gossip, about communities, accessing resources, and making money. So you see a lot of park vendors just selling trinkets and snacks and that kinds of things, because a lot of our residents don't have access to traditional employment, whether it's because of their immigration status or because they're older and have physical limitations. And so parks get used in a myriad of ways. And so it's really important to kind of frame it that way, because a lot of times when we design parks, from what I've seen, especially a lot of the new parks I see in the city, you see like places for people to jog, but not necessarily shade for older people to stay and sit for an extended period of time, right? Or you have parks that aren't necessarily the most accessible because, and in the case of one campaign that I'm working with NRDC on, and Remy as well, is the Elysian Park Lofts project. It's now been rebranded the Buena Vista Lofts. And so it's this luxury housing development that's trying to take advantage of all the public investment from both the Metro Gold Line station in Chinatown as well as the State Historic Park. It is a 900 unit all luxury housing project with 1,800 parking spaces, and it's been dubbed by community residents as the Great Wall of Chinatown. It's just the way it's designed, it's just like this giant wall that prevents access both visually and physically from the Solano Canyon Broadway side. And I'm seeing more and more of that, where like luxury housing projects are taking advantage of the public's investments in parks in low-income communities as an excuse to gentrify, and doing it through a lot of hostile architecture, and then a lot of private security that circles their property, but then also goes towards the park spaces and harasses people who are oftentimes the most park dependent, which are low income, youth, seniors, folks with disabilities, and houseless folks. And so for us, it's really about making sure that we have parks that are, and the surrounding communities are designed and programmed and managed in a way so that everybody feels welcome, and everybody has opportunity to enjoy the park, and that there's diverse uses and programs for different needs and different populations, but that we also make sure that folks don't get priced out of their neighborhoods as a result of park investments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sissy. And already some themes that I think others on the panel are going to touch on. But let's go ahead and move over. Liliana from FOLAR, maybe if you can share a little bit about what FOLAR's current access to nature efforts are looking like. I think FOLAR is known for its LA River advocacy, but I know there's a lot more happening with FOLAR.
Yeah.
I don't know. There we go. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So part of FOLAR's mission is not only to ensure ecological restoration for the LA River, but also to ensure equitable access to the river. Fuller has been around for over 30 years now, and really helped start the river movement and shift the way people view the river. Of course, before the LA area was colonized, the indigenous people like the Tongva and the Tatavian people respected the river and had this really unique relationship with their living waterway. But once, folks started coming in and building within the LA basin, the river was looking more like a threat as opposed to this gift. And so, after several floods that were happening, specifically in the 1930s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers decided to concretize and channelize the LA River. And this was a way to control the waters of the river so that it wouldn't destroy the homes that were built in the floodplain. Because, shocker, when you build in a floodplain, your home is probably going to get flooded. But once it was concretized, the river started looking more like a dumping ground instead of a living river. So in 1986, Louis McAdams, our founder, went down to the river and asked to speak on the river's behalf. And that was the start of Friends of the LA River. And through the years, Fuller has really helped elevate the river, bring a lot of resources to the river, but in doing so, we then have to ensure that, as the river becomes more attractive, that it's still going to be accessible for everyone and that it's a resource for everyone to enjoy. So, one of the major things that we do not want to happen along the river is for it to look like something along our coast, right? So if you want to go to the beach, if you're here in LA and you drive to the beach, it's really hard to find these public beaches because there are these barriers of massive private homes in the way. And then the public beaches that are there, you have to pay like $20 just to park nearby. So we really want to make sure that that doesn't happen to the LA River. And so because of that and through that, we have various ways in which we're ensuring equitable access along the river and access to nature. So the first is more a policy route through our Casitas campaign, which is to oppose a luxury development that we call Casitas Lofts, but also went through a rebrand like Elysian Loft, and it's now called True North Landing. But it's a proposed luxury development adjacent to the LA River and 100 acres open space. Which is really rare to see that much open space in Los Angeles, considering that half of Angelenos can't actually walk to a park. And so it's a really precious resource that we have here in LA. And so Fuller is part of a coalition where we work with NRDC, REMI, as well as other key river stakeholders like Clock Shop and LA River State Park Partners, where we are advocating that this development is the wrong development in the wrong place, and that it would really set a dangerous precedent for riverfront development. So I have an image here that Allison could kindly bring up, just so that folks can get a visual as to where I'm talking about this project. So wonderful, thank you. Here we have the proposed development, which is the blue, and the neighborhoods around the area have Elysian Valley, Cypress Park, LaSalle Park, and you can see the curvy line there is the LA River, and what's highlighted here is all this green space, and that's the 100 acres that I was talking about, and that's made up of 3 different parks, and obviously you can see that this Casitas development is located right at the north entrance of this open space. So, one of our concerns is that this development is going to block access to these 100 acres of open space and prevent opportunities for ecological restoration along the river, and also deter community members from entering and making it feel like it's a private park for the people who can afford to live in this luxury development. The project is also proposing 419 units, and only 35 of them will be affordable housing units. So this is not helping our affordable housing crisis and could cause harm to the communities that have been living in this neighborhood for generations. And it's also located near freeway. You can see the 2 freeway here. And, you know, we don't want to build more housing near freeway. And it's also being proposed in the historic floodplain area. So, you know, when we're thinking about climate change, we want to make sure that we're not building homes within a floodplain, trying to give our river some space to breathe, especially as we're learning how to adapt through our changing climate. So we can take that down, Allison. Thank you. And just, so that's kind of like our policy route of things, ensuring access to nature. And we also have an educational route through this. So we have a wonderful Source to Sea program where we offer free river education to Title I schools, where we are bringing our River Rover to schools, which is a mobile museum all about the LA River. And then we also host field trips at the river. And it's one of the most incredible experiences just to witness. So many of these students that we work with, their school is so close to the river, but they've never been there before. You know, and so it's so exciting to see their excitement. You know, they're saying like, is this wilderness? Like, can I bring my family here? And we also get questions like, how much is it to come here? You know, so it's really important to bring these community members to the river so that they know that this is their river, that they can come here whenever they want. They can bring their families here. They can go fishing. They can go walking. They can ride their bike. So it's just really important to break down those barriers and connect people to the river that founded the city that they call home. And then just lastly, we also have really fun community science programs that we're doing as well to connect people to the river. Some people don't even know how to access the river. You know, it's not super inviting with its really steep banks, but you know, being able to host nature walks and just showing folks all of the wonderful nature that's found in their own backyard is really important and just really at the root of FOLAR and ensuring equitable access to nature throughout Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Liliana. We'll keep it moving. We've got some questions coming in already, and I know I've got plenty of questions for you guys, but let's keep the conversation moving along. And let's get Lyric in here. So Lyric, I know Inclusive Action has been working with street vendors for years. And I don't think street vendors are often thought about when we talk about park access. So we're really happy to have you. What does park access mean to vendors, and what challenges have they faced, especially during the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Remy. I really appreciate you bringing up this question and being a part of this panel, because I think it's really important. So park access for vendors means access to economic stability. I'll start by explaining what role vendors play in their neighborhoods. So they often fill gaps in service, such as access to things like healthy food. So they'll sell fresh fruit or goods that they wouldn't otherwise, like community members might not otherwise have access to because of disinvestment that has traditionally happened in that neighborhood. So when park access is restricted for vendors, the effects pour over into the surrounding community, which Sissy had alluded to a little bit earlier. So I'll start with what it meant prior to COVID. Economic access, but also some of them, so economic access is absolutely what park access means to vendors. But some of the most stringent requirements and regulations for vendors are within parks. In 2018, California decriminalized street vending at the state level, which was a really big win. But prior to that, there were many issues. So I think a question of who has access is really important because it has historical implications, as Liliana was also just explaining. So I'll give an example of restricted access to parks. Limerick Park is a traditionally Black neighborhood, and it has a history of investment, then disinvestment, and now it's being gentrified. So it's seeing a lot of investment right now. The park itself, that the neighborhood of Limerick Park is named after, has a thriving vendor community, However, there's a covenant in the deed of the land that says that commercial business is not allowed there. This particular covenant sits within the same restrictive housing covenants that have long been outlawed, and they were due to redlining. Despite the housing covenants being pulled back and outlawed, this commercial piece is still there, but that means that the vital service that the vendors play in Limerick Park, they are no longer able to do so and instead are being criminalized for it. So the question arises, whose park is this and who gets access to the public right-of-way? The laws that were put in place once the state decriminalized vending were very strict, as I mentioned before, and it said stuff like folks could only stay on paved pathways and they had to be 200 feet from bathrooms or other structures, but that conflicted with state law, especially for food vendors. So the 200-foot rule, for example, you have to be within 200 feet to sell food in a park or anywhere actually with California state code, which means that food vendors are effectively banned from parks. But we know that that's a huge part of Los Angeles and the history of Los Angeles and the cultural vibrancy of Los Angeles. So at a very high level prior to COVID, park access to vendors and therefore economic stability was restricted. So now I'll move to what's happening during COVID. So vending has effectively been banned in the city of LA across the city. And then at the county level, they are cracking down on food vendors who do not have permits. Vendors are typically undocumented immigrants or seniors and predominantly women. So the people who are affected by this are low-income folks of color. They historically make about $10,000 to $15,000 a year, and so they have been heavily burdened by the impacts of COVID. The county health permit is a notoriously arduous process to get through, and so cracking down on enforcement of that is an effective ban. And on top of that, it allows for a misdemeanor violation. And because many of these folks are undocumented, that means that they are priority for deportation, or they can be priority for deportation under the current administration. So it makes it very difficult during COVID for everybody, of course, but especially vendors, especially being low income. And I think that it's really important that they be part of the recovery process because they really are the original open air dining experience in LA. Their businesses are made to be outside and do takeout. And these are the requirements that brick and mortars are now seeing. And brick and mortars are being given the priority to use spaces like parks or the sidewalk to do business. But vendors are not being meaningfully included in that process. And so, an example is brick and mortar businesses actually are being given an honor system for the health department. And like I was just saying, the health department has cracked down on vendors. So you can see that there's a double standard that's happening here. And that means that it's impacting lower income neighborhoods the most, especially as people are being told to stay home and access to food becomes more limited. So I can't stress enough that restricting access to parks for vendors really affects low-income communities the most, and it truly burdens the folks who are vending themselves because all of the processes were not built for them, and it's very difficult to move past it without there being a change in policy and potentially code later. And that, I think, will really, it'll ultimately help to build a thriving community and be really important when we talk about what post-COVID looks like and how we truly build from the bottom and move businesses up the ladder.
Thank you so much, Lyric. So many thoughts spinning in my own head right now, but we'll keep going. Steve, I want to get you in part of the conversation now too. Specifically, given the populations LA Can works with and your constituents, how has COVID and the current civil unrest highlighted or exacerbated park access issues for you and your constituents.
Thank you, Remy. I think just to start off with, hearing everybody talk, I thought it was really important just to say, it's really connected to hear the struggle. This is really about healthy communities and sort of who can access that space and who that space is benefiting. When you look at the community that we organize with and the neighborhood that we mostly focus on, we focus in Skid Row, Los Angeles, and in South Central, which are two historically forgotten communities when it comes to neighborhood amenities overall. And in Skid Row, Los Angeles, we have two parks that supposedly are larger than pocket parks, but oftentimes are very small. Beforehand, when you looked at park access in general, before COVID, sort of hostile architecture and sort of who can access parks when it comes to houseless folks was always an issue. Sort of property in parks in terms of how rest can happen in parks has always been an issue. And sort of COVID-19 and sort of the civil unrest, when we call the question of equity, really highlights that again, right? So when you look at COVID, for example, it really impacted our not having enough park space, really impacted our neighborhood's ability to go out when you live in a neighborhood that's mostly concrete and sort of try to have that moment of peace and that moment of silence to yourself. First and foremost, that was one example. Second of all, when your community is so dense and you don't have park space or you don't have sort of adequate building space or public rooms or community rooms, in your buildings where you live at, and then you have to go out and you don't have park space, then you're forced to sort of congregate on the street. And then you're labeled X person or X type of person because you're out on the street and people don't understand or want to understand what you're facing. It's really interesting also as we're hearing in terms of equity and sort of who can access what, when Lyric was talking about the same time that they were passing the city policy that made it a little bit easier to begin to criminalize street vendors in parks was exactly the same time that they were passing the city policy to make it more difficult for people to rest with property in parks. So for us, I would say it's not really changed much in terms of COVID or the unrest. It really just has highlighted and publicized the question around equity and around sort of who gets to benefit from these resources and these neighborhood amenities. Park space have historically been used as a space of criminalization, whether it be for the Black person that lives in South Central, brown person that lives in South Central, because of the way we look or because of the way people think we look. So COVID-19 and the racial uprising and that's occurring right now just really once again is calling the question to the table in a more visible public way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I definitely want to turn this more into discussion and dialogue. I mean, all of you are brilliant and amazing advocates who've been doing this work for some time, and I know your work overlaps in different areas, and maybe not as much as we should all be working towards in the future to really coordinate our efforts. So please feel free, panelists, to jump in if you have questions for one another. We've definitely got a number of audience questions that I'd like to get to. But first, I guess maybe one thing that I'd like to touch on before we move on, especially Lyric and Steve, I think it's just so important because, you know, park access, when you hear that, I think a number of people have a certain image in mind of like the organizations that do that work or the people who are impacted by parks or who want to go to parks. And I think the populations that both of you are working with don't always come up as like the first thought. And in particular, I'm wondering if you could each talk a little bit about how your organizations center the voices of the people who are impacted and just what that looks like. I know LA Can's been doing this work for a very long time in terms of land use and policies, and the street vendor campaign has been going on for some time. So for those in the audience who maybe are less familiar, if you could just share what your work looks like, and particularly what it looks like in terms of how you're actually working directly with the people who live in the space, who rely on the space, who work in the space. So Lyric or Steve, either of you, if you want to go first.
Okay. Thanks, Remy. So that's a fantastic question. Inclusive Action is one of the founding organizations of the LA Street Vendor Campaign. That started about, I think it was about 11 years ago. And this is actually, it's a second effort. There had been an effort in the mid-90s to decriminalize and legalize street vending, but it was shot down really quickly. So in the late aughts, I guess, they started up again. And it was two major things were happening. Vendors were being harassed by law enforcement, and they also were having their stuff taken, because that's like part of the penalty. If you're not vending, if you're not within the rules, they take all of your property. And yeah, so that was happening. And then at the same time, there were folks and policy wonks, for lack of a better word, who were thinking about street food and how to utilize Los Angeles's culture of street food in a way to make it more celebrated. And the two groups combined and essentially made the LA Street Vendor Campaign. So over the course of 10 years, there was a number of fluctuations. The city didn't take it on, the city of LA didn't take it on really until I think it was 2014. And yeah, then a number of years later, in 2018, the state actually decriminalized it, and that's really what forced the hand of having the city then to decriminalize and legalize it, because all jurisdictions within California can't enforce street vending rules unless they have a program, which means that vendors can essentially do what they like within a set of standard regulations. So now how we center the voices is the way that the Street Vendor Campaign is set up. We have a committee of vendor leaders who participate in all of the steering committee meetings, and they provide input and tell us what it is that they need in order to center the policy around what makes the most sense for them. So vending is a very flexible profession. There's folks who vend in one area or one space all the time. There's folks who only vend on the weekends. There's people who roam, and so there's mobile vending and stationary vending. And each of the vendor leaders has an organized group of vendors behind them. So they essentially are bringing up the concerns of their neighborhoods and then being able to bring it to the LA Street Vendor Campaign and say, like, hey, this is how these policies do or don't work for us. Yeah, I think that's really how we try and center the voices of the vendors and make sure that we're advocating for things that make the most sense for them. And I'm excited to hear about the way that LA Can centers the voices of their constituency.
Yeah, sure. So traditional community organizing is basically the way that we do it. LA Can is it's a primary power building based membership organization. So a lot of our work focuses on one-on-one contact, building specific committees, identifying sort of leadership within the community, and helping to build folks, not necessarily in the sense of us telling folks what they need, but folks working together hand in hand with not just organizers, but with allies and partners within that, of allies and partners of the organization, excuse me. So that's one of the ways that we sort of center it. Most of our work has historically been focused around power building. So we were built to ensure, even in our mission statement, when you look at it, it's all about ensuring that we have voice, power, and opinion in the decisions that are directly impacting us. So starts with community organizing principles, sort of hand-to-hand engagement, leadership development, building campaigns that change conditions, and sort of ensuring that folks directly impacted are at the forefront of that.
Thank you both. I think process is really important when we talk about the work that all of you are doing, and that process really is a model for, I think, what we would like to see happen all across the community. So similar kind of question for Sissy and Liliana around your work. I know you both work with stakeholders in your respective kind of target communities. Sissy, I know you organize with youth. If you could just share a little bit, both of you, about what your campaigns look like or how you work with the neighbors and the local people who actually live in the communities and are wanting more access to parks. So yeah, either of you, Sissy or Liliana?
Sure. So for Sika, we work in Chinatown and Lincoln Heights, and despite the name Chinatown, we're a lot more diverse than you would assume. So there are about 5 languages spoken in the neighborhood. So Khmer, several dialects of Chinese, Vietnamese, Spanish, and English. And so we oftentimes will do surveys, we train high school students, so we recruit them in 9th grade through a leadership pipeline that's multi-year. And we try to do interactive games and activities to teach them about like both historical and current conditions in their neighborhoods. A lot of times they see like they have fewer resources than other communities, and they just assume that's how it is, as opposed to it is a systemic and historical system that creates divestment in some communities, or crappy investment, I like to say, because we have a lot of investment, but historically it's been freeways and factories. And so, you know, how do we get them to understand that these are man-made situations and circumstances and conditions, and then we try to empower them and work with them to provide leadership training, public speaking, all kinds of different tools so that they can represent their voices and their communities. And I'll give you an example. We had a group of predominantly Chinese-speaking students. This was a couple years ago, and they had just come to the U.S. like maybe 2 or 3 years earlier, didn't speak English well, felt really embarrassed about their accents and their awkward, language skills. And one day, like, one of them looks at me and is like struggling to try and explain like what he was thinking. And I basically looked at him and was like, well, why don't you speak in Chinese and then have one of your friends translate? And it was just like this light bulb moment of like, one, not being punished for not being able to speak English properly, but then 2, making him realize that there's value in diversity, right? And by the end of the program, him and his friends just kind of felt this sense of like, I have a responsibility. So I don't speak great English, but I speak it better than my grandparents or my aunts and uncles and my parents. And I have a responsibility with my English skills and the resources that Sika has to advocate in City Hall, in the county Hall of Administration, to basically push for the needs of our communities, right? And so part of our process is like collecting surveys, because our students know, it's really easy for all of us to kind of advocate for the things that we want personally, but part of the Sika process is to show the students that there is a responsibility for them to represent the broad range of folks in our community, the small business owners, the street vendors, the seniors, the little kids, and the parents. Because when I think about park space and community engagement and park design, more often than not, the vast majority of voices, the loudest voices, and the design, and the design for new parks kind of reflects it. It tends to be mothers of young children, and then naturalists, right? But like I said before, in Chinatown, you have seniors, you have folks with disabilities, you have houseless folks, you have teenagers, little kids. And so one of the big things is we should be designing for all of those populations, right? Because that's how you get an equitable community. You don't design for the loudest voices, right? Which tend to be whiter, wealthier, and younger. Well, younger in the 20 to 30 something range. And so like if we're really going to create communities that are about cradle to grave, then we need to make different strategies for engaging and developing and building and designing for each subpopulation that utilizes parks and communities. And particular for me, like the people who are the heaviest users are also tend to be the most vulnerable to policing, to harassment, which are elderly people, houseless folks, the youth, and folks with disabilities. And so we need to center those voices before we go into talking about like, well, what do moms need? What do like private yoga instructors need?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Liliana, do you want to share a little bit about what the work looks like on the ground and how you work with other partners on some of your campaigns?
Yeah, so
I'm really lucky because I get to work with a coalition of a lot of really amazing people. So being able to be in communications with them, always sharing information with everyone. It's a little bit of a think tank working with all of these folks. We also really work hand in hand with a lot of community leaders, folks who are part of neighborhood councils, and just always trying to stay in contact with them, attending the various meetings that they host, so that we're not only keeping them updated on the work that we're doing, but that we're updated on everything that they're doing, what their needs are, what their concerns are, and make sure that we're all on the same page so that we can all help each other out. Before COVID, we really had an open door policy. Any community member who wants to stop by our office and come talk to us, we are here as a resource. We're here to support and provide whatever folks need. If you call our office, and you'll definitely talk to someone and we'll help you as much as possible. And then also just trying to provide as much support and resources for the community members. For example, we've taken folks to City Hall and given folks the tools to make comments or to schedule some meetings with different representatives so that we have that face-to-face communication with their elected leaders to share some of their concerns about what's happening along the river. And then, of course, just information sharing. If you try to keep up with anything that's happening along the river right now, it is so complicated. There's so many players in this game. There's so many layers to it. I'm working on it constantly, and it's hard for me to keep up with this stuff sometimes. So, I can't even imagine just a community member who's also doing their own work and dealing with their own life, and then also having to keep track of all of this stuff. So I think just trying to provide as much transparency as possible through all of this is also really key in working with the community members. I feel like the main thing is just like communication, just meetings and calls and just talking and sharing stories and ideas and taking action together.
Great. Kind of related to that, Liliana, maybe as a follow-up. So we've got tons of audience questions and some really amazing ones around the information sharing and keeping the community updated. An audience member has asked about the status of the Casitas Lofts project and where it's at. And so if you could give an update to everybody for those who've been following.
Great. I wanted to give an update, and the first one was like, I'm talking too much already. I need to stop. So perfect. Earlier this year, the draft environmental impact report was released. We got 2 extensions to that so that folks could make comments. At the tail end of that comment period, COVID did hit. People couldn't go to libraries to access the draft EIR, but we were still able to get folks to participate in that. And we got almost 500 comment letters sent to the city with community members sharing their concern for the project, for the Casitas project. Right now, we are waiting to receive comments. I think right now they're looking at a couple of months until they respond to some of these comments that we've submitted. So we're kind of in a bit of a waiting game right now. But we are still, updating folks. No update is still an update, and still having folks engage with us, whether it's, just learning more about the project. And, we just want to make sure that it's still on people's radar, because once something does release, we're going to have to move immediately. So continuing to engage folks on this while it's a bit of a waiting period, because, once things hit, we got to move really quickly, and we want folks to be ready to take action with us.
Great, thank you. We also had a question, which I'm pretty sure most folks on this panel have been mulling over for years, which is around how to address the balance between public investment, and in this case, specifically for parks, and gentrification. But I think, we can think about this question even broader than parks, because I know, downtown and Skid Row communities feeling the pressure of gentrification. How do we balance wanting investment in communities that have historically been disinvested in, but protecting communities from what feels like kind of an out of control monster of gentrification sometimes. So does anybody want to jump in? Sissy, I know we've talked a lot about this. I don't know if you want to kick it off, but I know Lyric and Steve, you guys, the work you do also wrestles with this kind of question. So anybody want to go?
Can I just say, I think it has to start off with investment should not equal gentrification, right? It's not an either or. We all want investment. We all want better neighborhoods. The only difference is we don't want new neighbors. We want the same neighbors as communities are transforming and are changing, right? A lot of us have lived in our communities for decades and sort of have suffered from the broken lights, the messed up crosswalks, the stores that sell the overpriced food. And as things are changing, we want the better stuff. We just don't want to be mistreated as we go in to access the better stuff. We want to be able to afford the better stuff. And we definitely don't want to be harassed because speculation is occurring at sort of a rapid rate in our neighborhoods. So I think for me, it doesn't start off with why one should create the other. Is like the other shouldn't create the investment shouldn't create gentrification. It's not about either or.
Others want to jump in?
So,
and sorry, I jumped the gun on that one.
Oh, no. I totally agree with Steve. I wanted to be the history nerd too, to kind of want to acknowledge that our low-income communities were created that way, right? It wasn't just by accident. The fact that freeways were built on top of our communities, that fact to be built next door to our homes, right? Those things devalued our land, right? And devalued our communities. On top of all the racial covenants that said that people of color weren't allowed to own their own properties, like, there's all these layers there. And then once we started organizing, low-income communities of color started organizing, demanding better things, that's when the developers saw this as an opportunity. Yeah, let's do public investment, and that will drive up values, and that will drive up my real estate. And that's when you start seeing gentrification happening. It doesn't happen when new people move in. It happens when poor people get moved in, their properties and their communities get destroyed to lower the value so that the rich people can come in on a fire sale, right? And then use the public dollars to artificially bolster land values, right? And so this isn't to say that we don't want parks. Just like Steve said, we want all of the same things that everybody else does. A safe community where we can afford the rent, where we can breathe the air and have friendly neighbors, right? And how do you do that? So a lot of my work, some of you know, is specifically around green gentrification. I'm like trying to work on finishing this guide that's been on my plate for 2 years. And part of it is there's strategies that are for park agencies. And so for us, we organized and last year got the county to adopt a displacement avoidance policy as part of the Measure A, which is a parcel tax for parks, the expenditure plan for it, right? And so the idea was all this investment is coming when you get a new park. How do we make sure that low-income communities get opportunity to access some of that investment, right? So it could be something as little as you're hosting a community meeting and you have to buy snacks. So let's buy the snacks from the local bakery, right? But then it could also be like looking at procurement of, construction equipment, soils, like hiring people who have employment barriers and people who live in the local community, to allowing for vending that targets like first-time entrepreneurs, lower income people. Because, I go to Echo Park and I see like the hipster $5 or $6 horchata latte vendor, in the boathouse. It's like, why couldn't we have an elote vendor as well? Like, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? There's a lot of different strategies in which park agencies can play a role. The other is to ensure that the surrounding uses don't include hostile architecture, don't include over policing, all of those different elements. But then lastly, it's really up to cities and counties and government to make sure that we don't over police people, that we do land use policies like value capture, inclusionary housing. I'm sorry, I'm getting really nerdy. To make sure that as new investment comes in, that we are actively protecting the low income folks that are most vulnerable to getting pushed out, right? Like, you do that at the beginning, you don't do it at the end. If you do it at the end, then everybody's gone.
Then you started totally wrong if you do it at the end. That's the problem, right?
Well, you didn't really start. You just kind of did it to say you did it.
Exactly. It's a check. It's a box.
And that's why, I wanted to share with folks your process, because I think so much of this does come down to process. I think a lot of us know what some of those policy solutions need to be, but if we're not inclusive in the process and bringing the people in to make the decisions, right? Like Steve, like the people need to have a voice and have a direction, give their direction. And so I think all of you really represent the work that's happening in that process, that is not ticking boxes of engagement and not after the fact bringing people along, but letting the people lead. And that's what I really appreciate about all of your work.
And I would also add,
yeah,
not just about process, like, are we translating our meetings, but it's about, at the very beginning, ensuring equitable outcomes, right? Planning for, like, we know this is going to happen, gentrification is going to happen, so what are we going to do to reduce the risk as much as possible, right? How are we going to minimize it? Just like the city sets these goals of, like, we're going to have 100,000 new units of housing. Well, why can't they set a goal for 50,000 units of affordable?
right. All right, I want to try to tackle a few more of these questions because we're getting a lot, so we'll move on. There's been quite a few questions around collaboration and what that looks like, and that's something I was definitely thinking about in preparation for today as well. I know all of you work in coalitions, many coalitions sometimes, and some of you are in coalition together. In particular on this issue of equitable access and investment to parks, what does that collaborative look like right now? Who else is working on these issues, and how are you broadening the collaborative effort to make connections to folks that maybe wouldn't normally be in the conversation, or show that these are issues that relate to other people's work? So if anyone wants to talk about what collaboration in park equity looks like, what you're doing in terms of your own collaborative work, and what that needs to look like, maybe where we need to be going moving forward.
So just to start off, I think this panel is the best example of collaboration, especially when it comes to park work, and very somewhat connected, but also very diverse organizations working together, right? So like NRDC working with Elysian, historically we have known each other, but we haven't necessarily worked at this level of detail. But we have worked with Sissy, we have worked with Remy, we have worked with Lyric. So sort of because of those relationships, and those relationships knowing the population and the work that we do, we were able to build an opportunity to sort of tell our story. So I think in terms of like collaboration, this is an example of how it's happening a lot right now. But I'll sort of leave it there.
Others want to jump in? I know, Liliana, you're in lots of collaborative.
Definitely. I think also just acknowledging where you lack knowledge and leaning on your partners to help you with that. You don't have to be an expert in everything, and you can lean on other folks who know more about a specific thing. So, communicating with folks, asking for help, and having these dialogues with other people to help gain a new perspective for yourself, for your organization, and for the greater cause that you're working for. So just acknowledging that and then working towards understanding more, obviously, but also just relying on all the other expertise that's in the room, and sharing conversations with those folks.
Just to
Something
add,
oh, go ahead.
oh, go for it.
I was just going to say, I think it's also really important to have like meaningful relationships. So part of coalition work is tension. And so being able to like lean into the tension and understand that sometimes you're going to disagree, and like the real progress happens when you disagree. When you're able to like really parse through all the details and all the issues and determine what it is that you want to get to, because ultimately really everybody typically has the same goal. It's more on how you get there and what makes the most sense, and at that time especially, you know. And doubling down on what Liliana was saying with like being able to acknowledge the things you don't know. So something for the LA Street Vendor Campaign, I was remiss to not name the other founding organizations, but ELAC is absolutely integral, and they are our organizers, and now the Community Power Collective is like the organizing crew for street vendors that came from ELAC. And they're the ones that the street vendors went to when they were being harassed, saying like, hey, please help us. You know, we need to uplift this issue, and you guys are the best way we know how to do that. And they're like, yeah, absolutely. And so they picked it up, got together with other folks who were talking about these things to make sure that the street vending campaign happened. And then also really integral was the LA Food Policy Council, because they are food experts. And so understanding the food culture of street vending and being able to bring that to the forefront, understanding it also as like an economic development issue. Yeah, so I just wanted to uplift those two really major points. Oh, I'm so sorry. Also, public counsel. They are the people's lawyer. We all know how much we love public counsel as the people's lawyer within Los Angeles. So we like, oh man, there's so many things just outside of street vending too. We would not be able to get done without public counsel. So yeah, I just want to say that, yeah, their collaboration is tension, but also progress and friendship and true relationship building.
Just building the time, spending the time to build those relationships.
And I would say too, it's about allyship and echoing each other's issues. I will say when Sika first started engaging in LA River restoration work, just because the river cuts through Chinatown and Lincoln Heights, you know, we kept bringing up the gentrification issue, and, you know, folks that we thought, a lot of the environmental folks were like, yeah, that's too bad, but river, right? And kept kind of saying, but this is our issue and this is a bigger priority, and like we'll figure it out later, right? One of the first river advocates actually said something different was actually Marissa, the executive director of FOLAR, where she just pulled me aside after, you know, a panel that we had with Claire, and she's like, Sissy, I don't know what to do with this issue. I know it's important, but we're not a housing organization. What can we do that won't like overwhelm our organization? And one of the things I just said was, just say it's an issue, say that there needs to be a solution, and that there needs to be experts brought into the room, right? Like she didn't need to understand the nuances of like rent control, tenant protections. It was more like being able to be an echo chamber so that whenever I wasn't in the room, there was someone else saying this is an issue. We need to bring in experts, right? And so that's what I mean. And so whenever I talk about like street vending, you know, I just bring it up as a random issue in the park space, and then like try to make sure that room is made for people like Lyric to come in later with more detailed, thoughtful analysis. Like I don't need to know everything. I just need to know enough to say this is an issue and to push it as a good ally.
Thank you all. That was really amazing conversation, and I'm hoping a lot of people on the webinar got something important out of that. I also wanted to pull another question from the audience. I feel like everyone sort of touched a little bit on what equitable access, park access looks like. We've talked a little bit about equitable investment, talked a little bit about equitable design, or at least what inequitable design looks like. Does anyone want to chime in and kind of flesh that out a little bit more? What, in addition to ensuring we have affordable housing near parks, what are some strategies or efforts that you're aware of or part of to ensure equitable park access for communities? And what does that look like for our audience to kind of understand a little bit more? Does anybody want to share what that could look like for the communities you work with in particular?
I can just say from like a Skid Row lens, for us, it's really around programming, making sure that we have the same type of programming that's occurring at Grand Park, for example, Gladys Park, access to the resources. So for example, we have basketball courts in Gladys Park, which is one of our main neighborhood parks. It was actually a neighborhood activist in his group, neighborhood activist named General Jeff, who actually had to lead the effort to get the resources to repave the basketball court, instead of the city sort of investing in the sort of the need to bring in the payment, bring in the exercise equipment, bring in the benches. So just equitable access to the resources in terms of how they're spent elsewhere. And then hours of operation, right? For example, historically in downtown, especially specifically in Skid Row, for the longest, the parks would get closed at a certain time. They still do, but now they're closed a little bit later. So just understanding like the need from the neighborhood to be able to access that space at certain times because they're being put out of a shelter or because they just need to be able to get out and get some fresh air. Those are like three concrete examples that I can share from like a Skid Row perspective.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I'm making sure that things are culturally appropriate for the area, making sure that the programming is going to be used by the community that's there. Don't bring in these random things and the community's like, what am I going to do this? What am I going to do this with? Like, what about like things that we want to do? Make sure you have a soccer field in there. If the community wants to play soccer, make sure there's barbecue pits. People want to have barbecue and enjoy a birthday party out in the park. Not everyone is a bird nerd like myself who wants to go birding. Make sure you have a variety of things to offer at a park that everyone can enjoy, specifically the community that's adjacent to those areas. And also just the programming and facilities, making sure that there's no language barrier there, that the signage is in multiple languages so that everyone can understand what's being presented in front of them. Just making sure it's culturally appropriate for the area.
Liliana, just as a follow-up, because this was also asked in the question, and I feel like your work on Casitas, as well as Sissy, your work with the Elysian Park Lofts connects. Could you also chime in a little bit around the psychological access and what that means, or what at least psychological inaccessibility looks like, right? And how do we ensure that the community feels welcome in a public space that is supposed to be for everybody? And what are the challenges that you're encountering in that, and what would it look like? You alluded to it earlier with, we don't want it to feel like the beach, but is there anything else you want to add around kind of that psychological access?
Yeah, Casitas in itself is going to be like a very tall development, where it's just going to be like a physical barrier to the open space, as well as just, they're probably going to have some high-end restaurant that's there that then, folks who are in the area might not be able to afford to buy food there. And then it just feels weird and awkward, like they don't belong in that space, which is completely wrong. That is their park. They've been living there for generations and they should have access to it and not feel out of place in the community that they've grown up in their whole life. So making sure that these barriers aren't being created to make people feel uncomfortable in a place that they should feel relaxed and safe in. Let's see if you have more to add.
So I always think about specific experiences that I've had or SECA members have had at different parks. There's a park in the Arts District that's just north of Skid Row, like right where Earth Cafe is. And I was walking past it one day and had realized public I thought it was a private park because it was a dog park with fencing all over it and all kinds of like security lights. And then there was like a little plaque that said funded by the city of LA. I literally thought it was a private park, right? I speak English, you know, I'm able-bodied, I'm like upper middle class, and I didn't feel welcome, right? Because of the way it was designed with all the fencing and the security and all of this stuff, right? Or you have the park in Glendale that's surrounded by the Americana, you know, which apparently the park in the middle is actually a public park, but you have to walk through luxury stores, basically a mall, in order to be able to access it, right? And of course, there's security, private security all around it. And so when I think about like Elysian Park Lofts, it is literally a wall, you know, like 20-story wall that kind of psychologically says that this is a physical fence that we are creating to prevent the Chinatown folks and the Solano Canyon folks from being able to even see, because it's so tall. Like they're blocking visual access to this 33-acre park. And then the last experience that I'll share was, this was about maybe 3 years ago. SECA partners with Community Nature Connection to take our students out camping, or we did until COVID, like once or twice a year. And so most of our kids have never been camping, right? You know, they're low income, urban, they don't know what a tent is. And so it's a really great experience for them, but because it's their first time, they don't know what is the appropriate protocol for how to behave, you know, and so usually it just ends up being the student like injures themselves a little by not being extra safe. But in this case, there was a wealthy couple that was doing like an engagement photo shoot and basically started screaming and verbally attacking our students, our staff, started screaming, and then took one of our staff's cell phones and threw it away and threatened to call the cops. Franklin Canyon's like a huge park, right? It's not like one of those things where it's, you know, a postage size stamp space where you can't go anywhere. It's like they could have just walked 20 feet, but instead they chose to yell and verbally harass our students. And so our students just felt like, I guess camping isn't for me.
Design is so important. Like when you think about design and like what folks are talking about, building a building that basically resembles a wall in a community that has historical ties to that is like the most craziest thing ever. And like thinking about design, like from our perspective, there was Grand Park that had a dog park that had water fountains. Our neighborhood, 2 neighborhood parks, did not have access to water or bathrooms at that time. When we talk about like how crucial like design and sort of understanding design and how that links is so important.
I'll add one small thing too. So I'm here to talk about street vending, but something else that we're a part of is the Adopt a Lot program with the city of LA to utilize vacant lots for like basically pocket parks essentially. And we do a community design process to determine what's on the park space. And I think just to second what Steve is saying right now with the design, we did a participatory design process for this park up in Pacoima or like North Hills area. And amazingly, it was actually a bunch of kids who decided it. So there's a school across the street. So when we did a voting day, it was like 60% little babies that were 7 or 8 years old, which is fantastic. And so on the opening day, when we had everything built and stuff like that, what they were anticipating and what they had voted on to create, they didn't use at all in a way that they had originally voted on, which I think is really fantastic too, to be able to allow for the creativity and the needs of the folks who are using the park in a way that's equitable and flexible. So my example is, which I found so funny, they voted on a little lounge space, which is fantastic because the little kids coming from school are like, I just need to chill. And so they voted on this little lounge space. But the first thing they did when they got to the park was start dancing. And so they got on this little platform and started using the lounge space for a dance space instead, which I think is also really fantastic. And I just want to, really drive the idea of participatory design and making sure that your definition of stakeholders is truly the people who surround that area and not just the people who are interested in being in that area. Yeah.
So I think we've touched on quite a bit of the questions. I did see that it looks like there's a number of people who, work in park organizations or are otherwise coming from a park space, and they're interested in getting more involved in equitable access and equitable developments of parks. I know a few of you are involved in some efforts and, again, collaborations that are specifically talking about equitable development of parks, as well as joint development of parks and affordable housing and other community benefits. Does anyone, I don't know, Sissy or Lyric or anybody from the panel want to just talk a little bit about some of the collaborations or spaces that are talking about equitable development related to parks so people can be aware of that?
Sure. I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking, so I was hoping Lyric would step up, but I know I'm like the nerd in this space. So Sika helped create and founded the La Rosa Collaborative, which is the LA Regional Open Space and Affordable Housing Collaborative. And it brings together, NRDC and Inclusive Action are part of it, but it brings together the affordable housing sector and the park development sector to kind of figure out, specifically, we came together to try and figure out what we can do around the green gentrification issue and how do you build parks without gentrifying neighborhoods. And one of the strategies we're looking at is like the co-development of parks and housing together. And so one of the first things we did was we did a national scan to see what's going on out there. And so we were seeing a couple different models. One was park projects that were heavily gentrified. And so you see projects like, for example, the New York High Line and the Atlanta Beltline, where all these luxury developments build up right next to like these trails and these linear parks. And create a wall effect, of luxury housing along the trail or the loop, in the case of the Beltline. And then alternatively, we saw projects where there were parks and affordable housing, and the design was very different. You could tell like that the way they had designed it was really to kind of take into consideration a number of issues and needs that the neighborhood had identified previously. And so we saw projects, we took trips to Oakland, to Lions Creek Crossing right by the Oakland Coliseum station, Paradise Creek in National City. Like I went to Westminster, Colorado, and one of the things that we saw was, and learned was the projects were these large open spaces that were being redeveloped, right? In the case of Lions Creek Crossing, it was like a public housing project that was being redeveloped, and it was like, I think 11 acres of land or 14 acres of land. They started with like, what's going on in the community? What do you guys want and what do you guys need, right? So they didn't close it off like, well, we're only building a park or we're only building housing. It was like they wanted to capture the whole range of needs. And then from there, they utilized design to try and capture as much of that need as possible. Obviously, like site considerations, funding, make certain things more challenging and not necessarily possible. But I think first and foremost, it was really about understanding that need. But it does take a lot of work to get the sectors, because how parks work and how housing works is really different, right? And how they're funded and how they're operated and managed is really different. And so a lot of it is about learning from each other and taking that time to build those authentic partnerships. But I think it's that authentic partnerships where you get the best outcomes.
Great, thank you. And I think, Sissy, we'll keep you going here. Well, we're going to move into closing remarks. So, because I want to be mindful of the time, we're at 7:15, and I want to give everybody an opportunity to share specifically, any closing remarks, obviously, but along the lines of engagement, and the folks that are still on the webinar and those that are going to be watching after, there's been questions about what can we do? And I know each of you is working on a variety of different things, and it would be great to share anything you'd like the audience to know about in terms of your work, how they can get involved, how they can contact your organization or find out more about campaigns, or any just closing remarks you want to make before we wrap up. So Sissy, you want to kick us off again, and then we'll move on.
Sure. I think for us, I think Allison's going to put up a slide of all of our contact information. Tika's actually working on a lot of different initiatives, so it's a little bit chaotic, I will fully admit. But one of the things that we're working on with Steve and LA Can actually is the downtown community plan and how, the city is envisioning the future of downtown, which includes Chinatown, Little Tokyo and Skid Row. And a lot of it is about making a world-class city and, building housing for people of all income levels, which is typically code for luxury housing. And for us, it's about pushing back and centering the lowest income and the most vulnerable folks. And so I would say for all the folks that are listening in your work, rethink what you're doing and take in the perspective of the people who are the most vulnerable, right? Who are the most likely to be policed, who are most likely to be displaced or end up in homeless or are disabled. And, how is the work you're doing meeting their needs, right? As opposed to the assumption that this is good for the city. Well, because oftentimes when people say this is good for the city, it's good for the people who are higher income, who are the most vocal, and the most vocal is oftentimes a minority. And so for us, if you're interested in our work, please feel free to reach out to me. But I would say, really centering equity isn't just talking about, are we making space so that Black folks are welcome to come in, but not welcome to speak, right? I would say that.
Thank you so much, Sissy. Liliana, do you want to share any closing remarks or calls to action for those out there?
Yeah, definitely. I think Allison's going to put up a slide right now. But as I mentioned before, we're a little bit in a waiting period right now with the Casitas campaign, but sooner than we know it, we're going to have to take action quickly. So I would encourage folks who are interested in getting involved in this campaign to join our website, folar.org/Casitas, and sign up for our action alerts, and we'll be sure to shoot you an email, maybe even a text, to let you know when it's time to take action. We also, obviously right now, we can't take folks directly to the river with public programming, but we will be having really amazing online virtual programs, bringing the river to the people, to your homes, in the month of October. It's called Return to the River. So also be on the lookout for that. And we'll be sharing that through email as well as through our social media platforms. So you can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook to be updated on the various things that are happening along the river.
Thank you so much, Liliana. Lyric.
So with street vending, since 2018, there's been a lot of moving parts, and the County of Los Angeles actually just submitted their recommendation report for what the regulations will be for LA County, that's unincorporated areas. And what's nice about that is a lot of times the smaller cities will sometimes adopt similar ordinances. And we really like the report. The one piece that's very difficult is the parks piece, actually. So the parks regulations were not thought about holistically the same way the rest of the report was. They were actually done by a totally different department, and they didn't engage stakeholders like DCBA had. And so we're anticipating that report is going to go to the Board of Supervisors probably after their recess. It's not going to be this coming Tuesday before their recess, but most likely in September or early October. And we're definitely going to want folks to be calling in and submitting comment specifically to try and change the park regulations because they are so stringent and will heavily restrict park access to vendors. As I mentioned before, the LA Street Vendor Campaign is very much a coalition. Inclusive Action, Community Power Collective, and Public Council are definitely the people to look after for information on that. And then the LA Street Vendor Campaign itself has a Facebook that you should definitely go check out. We update it with different things that are happening. And our most recent thing, if you feel so inclined, we do have a GoFundMe for workers, for the street vendors who are not able to get access to other funding. Yeah, the Street Vendor Emergency Fund can be found on our page, Inclusive Action for the City. And please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Lyric. Steve.
Yeah, so I would say a couple things. One is definitely the civil unrest and the rebellion has really called the question of access in this nation and across the world. So that right there should be your first sort of calling card to call out and sort of point out an inequity as you see it. We can no longer be in a space of where we allow inequity to just happen or talk about that we're against inequity and yet don't have a plan to address it or a plan to call it out at the very least. I will start off with that. And then second of all, I'll just close out. I want to echo Sissy's point around the downtown community plan. Downtown right now has been historically one of the most contested spaces overall for over the last few decades. And the downtown community plan is going to call the question around millions and millions of dollars as Los Angeles transitions. As you can tell from the council member who was making millions of dollars himself, helping to facilitate development. So getting engaged with the community plan process is going to be extremely important because as they design and sort of talk about what can be put where and sort of what's going to be offered for what, that's really sort of where the struggle is going to be at in terms of calling the question around equity or inequity that's going to be created at the city level.
Thank you, Steve. And yes, the Central City United Coalition has their own website, and I believe later we'll share even more resources and how you can get these links, and hopefully that will be part of that. I want to invite NRDC back into the space. They've graciously let us kind of just take over and have this conversation, but I believe they've also been working on a variety of things, including some of the campaigns mentioned. But Damon, I don't know if you had a specific ask you'd like to share with everybody.
Sure, thanks, Remy. And first, just thank you so much to the panelists. I am in awe. It was such a rich discussion, and I'm just so privileged to be able to work with all of you. It is truly a joy. And I just wanted to jump in here and mention quickly a piece of legislation that NRDC and many others are supporting, Assembly Bill 3030. This is a bill that would establish a state policy of improving access to nature, something we've been talking about tonight, and also protecting at least 30% of California lands and waters by 2030. The legislature is debating this measure right now, so now is the time to weigh in. And so go ahead and go to our blog and action page to learn more and to take action. And to figure out how to do that, I'm going to kick it back to Remy and Allison.
Thanks, Damon, and just huge thank you to all of our panelists. Like Damon said, I also just feel so lucky to get to work with all of these people on a regular basis and over the years. As you heard, they're up to a lot of incredible work that hopefully you'll find out more about as you go to their websites and their socials. And yes, Allison has helped us all navigate to those different websites and social handles. So I think she has a quick and easy way for you to find those links that she's going to share now. Allison?
Hi, everyone, and thanks to all the incredible panelists. I just want to share out that we invite you to go to our Equitable Access to Nature action page. We've compiled all of these slides, and it will lead you to all of the different links that all the panelists have shared and just allow you to stay involved with all of this incredible work. So thank you guys so much.
Great. And Allison, is that link in the chat, or where can folks get that? Sorry.
Yeah, so I just released the link in a a question and answer announcement. So it should appear at the top of the screen in a little green hyperlink.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for all the people who were behind the scenes helping make this happen so that I could focus on the conversation and didn't have to read all of the amazing questions. And thank you to all of the people who came out tonight, to our audience. I think we had well over 150 people at least, and incredible questions. I know you have lots of options for what to do with your evenings, so the fact that you joined us, we really appreciate it. And thanks again to NRDC and our amazing panelists, and hope to talk to you all soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And I'm just going to release that announcement once more to make sure that that link is accessible.
Cool. Are we still live?
Yes.
Okay.
Just ending now.
No idea what's going on.